Ek gesels vanoggend met Desmond Annandale en hy is 'n Navorsingsassistent by die Universiteit Stellenbosch se Departement Landbou-ekonomie. Desmond, welcome to Grootplaas.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's really nice having you, and thank you for your hard work with this study. I want to make a statement. South Africa's agricultural exports to the rest of Africa seems like they are declining. Tell me more.
Yeah, so essentially what we've seen in the past 10 years is that the value of South Africa's agricultural exports into Africa have remained fairly stable. For example, between 2011 and 2021, the value of South Africa's agricultural exports into Africa have only increased by less than $500 million, whereas to the rest of the world, the exports have increased in value by nearly $2.5 billion. So it's not so much that the exports aren't increasing, it's that the growth of exports into Africa is increasing at a far slower pace than what we're seeing with the rest of the world.
Now, the African Free Trade Agreement provides an opportunity to increase exports. In detail, how so?
Yeah, so the African continent has, in the past couple decades, attempted to increase regionalism, as has the rest of the world. And as a result, there are 8 regional economic communities within Africa, as well as different other trade agreements and different trade protocols that need to be followed. And an issue with this is that the interrelated rules of origin and other requirements and benefits that countries have to adhere to in order to trade under these different regimes leads to inefficiencies and confusion, with simple things like paperwork and those sorts of things become a lot more complicated. And so what the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement is trying to do is to cut the spaghetti bowl and form a single regime that the different countries within Africa can trade under. And in addition to this, the countries that have signed onto this agreement, which is most African countries, bar one, is that they agreed to try and make the cross-border movements of products a lot easier and almost like a one-stop border post.
Yes.
Because one of the major issues that we face in Africa is logistical challenges, which include poor infrastructure and cross-border times. Yeah.
How did you approach your study? Where did you begin? Why did you think it was necessary to focus on this aspect? And how did you do it? What did you take in account? And obviously your ultimate findings.
Yeah, so my main finding throughout reading the different literature that looks at regional integration, especially within the African context, is that a lot of authors have tried to investigate the macroeconomic effects of trade integration. So what happens at the macro level, the country level.
Yes.
What I wanted to do was try and assess the specific export opportunities at the product level that may come to fruition as a result of increased integration. And so I applied various different trade indices that look at the nature of trade that South Africa shares at the product level, the HS6 level, between South Africa and the rest of the African continent and the rest of the world. And in addition to that, I compiled a composite country priority index, which basically takes data from the World Bank, World Economic Forum, and other reputable organizations and ranks countries according to how we feel economically they should be in terms of their size and potential as an export market, and compared that to how South Africa actually trades with these different countries. Yeah, and I found that South Africa's exports into Africa are highly concentrated in a few markets, specifically within the SADC region, especially neighboring countries, and that this may cause an issue given, for example, if there's a political instability issue in a specific country, and South Africa is highly dependent on this country as an export market, then this could cause problems. So what I thought was perhaps diversifying South Africa's agricultural exports into different African countries that are now more accessible due to reduced tariffs under the African Continental Free Trade Area and increased access may build resilience in South Africa's value chain.
I want to focus on the diversity. How should that be done? Obviously, it's easy saying that, but according to your findings, how should they do it?
Yeah, so obviously it is difficult because we have this free trade agreement, the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is going over a 5 to 10 year process of tariff reductions and increased investment in infrastructure and making the paperwork easier to trade with different countries. However, distance is a major issue. So like I was saying earlier, with Africa trading a lot with its neighboring countries, it's because they are just closer. And another main thing about that is sharing common languages. So for example, English or Afrikaans, if that is a shared language, then it makes it a lot easier for the man on the ground, the businessman that's running the firm, to actually communicate with someone else in the export market. So I do think that further research is needed in this regard in terms of identifying the different aspects that increase trade or allow for trade to be facilitated at the business level, so firm level. And by identifying these different aspects, then policies can be adjusted and aligned to encourage cooperation amongst the individuals running the enterprises in the different countries.
Desmond, we're going to continue our chat just now. Ons moet gebreek vir advertensie. Bly ingeskakel. Ek gesels met Desmond Annandale en ons praat 'n bietjie oor sy studie wat hy gedoen het, wat eintlik mag gaan oor uitvoere van Suid-Afrikaanse produkte. Desmond, your study, why do you feel there's a need to focus on a theme like this? Obviously, exports are extremely important for the agricultural industry as a whole. And just according to you, obviously you've spoken to farmers, you've spoken to people. Why is it so important to focus on this aspect?
Yeah, so I believe that, so exports are a major source of foreign income, and especially in times of the volatile exchange rates that we are experiencing now and have been, earning foreign income is obviously a strong point. Another thing that we've seen in the past few years is the increased protectionism levels across the world. So, for example, the European Union halfway through last year initiated new cold chain storage rules for South African citrus exports. And the requirements were that citrus exports were to be kept at a temperature of below 2 degrees Celsius for a period of up to 25 days. And that was to prevent pulse codling moth from getting into the European markets. This obviously impacts on the farmers' competitiveness in those different markets.
Yeah.
Because the price to do this obviously just makes the whole cost of operating and exporting a lot higher. And what I feel is that this can definitely damage a farmer's export earnings and the country's export earnings as a whole, especially for such a valuable industry like the citrus industry. And so focusing on identifying new export opportunities and shortening the global value chains, which is a trend that we've been seeing around the world, would hopefully build resilience within the South African value chain, export value chain. And with the case with the specific reference to Africa, we've seen there's a huge expanding population, GDP growth that is expanding and only being beaten by Asia, so the second fastest growing continent in the world according to GDP, rising incomes, increased urbanization. And so with this, what we get is changing food demands and dietary requirements, and more convenience foods are being demanded within Africa. So given the African Continental Free Trade Area, a massive opportunity is presented to exporters from all over Africa to try and tap into these new markets that are now more accessible given tariff reductions and increased trade facilitation. So for South Africa to identify specific opportunities and to jump on the bandwagon per se early on would be a strong advantage for our exporters to gain that market share.
Yeah, and you also strongly believe that you mentioned earlier that more research should be done in this field, because if we look at the potential, like you've just mentioned, it's massive. So where would you like the research to be focused on?
That's a great question. I think that the research should be focused on assessing the different value chains and value chain linkages within the African continent and South Africa's own agricultural industry, agricultural export industry, as this will allow us to identify just where we can shorten the value chain, make it more efficient, and how the government can provide incentives to allow for this to happen. Research into the social conduct and performance, for example, in different African countries, at the firm level, at the country level, will assist in identifying those countries that seem stable, that are on the growth or on the rise, and what sort of patterns we are seeing with their demand increases, the types of foods they are increasing, the demand for, in addition to that, looking at processing capacity. So
Absolutely.
in South Africa, if you look at imports of wheat, so we are a net wheat importer, but our exports of processed wheat flour are strong and high in South Africa. So what that means is South Africa is acting in that regard as a regional hub for wheat. So we are importing the wheat from other countries like Ukraine or Russia or the States, processing it and then exporting it into Africa. So that's a good example of value addition. And if we can identify more products that we can do that with to act as a regional hub, or even to process our own products that we grow here to export into Africa, would be very useful.
Absolutely.
And further research.
Desmond, obviously we've got about 1 minute left. So doing a study like you've done and coming to a finding and a conclusion like you've done, where would you like this study and the conclusion be used? What's the next step forward?
Yeah, so I think the next step forward is that what I've demonstrated is that freely available market data on TradeMap, which is a platform run by the International Trade Center, and simple to use indices, trade indices, are a first step in identifying potential export opportunities, and are simple to understand, interpret, and put on a graph to display.
Yes.
So I've basically shown a methodology that can be used. And then from there, you identified these products, you've identified these countries. From there, you would still need to further assess what the conditions are in the country. And this would require perhaps going to the countries, looking at their value chains and speaking to key informants on the ground about what the markets are like. But it's basically just the first step in how you can assess market opportunities.
Absolutely. Desmond, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for your trouble doing the study, and good luck with further endeavors.
Thank you very much.